Chief Val Daniels, and in this lesson, I will discuss California Penal Code Section 196, justifiable homicide, as well as Penal Code Section 835 as it relates to use of force. The information presented here was current as of July 2025. As you know from this class, the law can change quite regularly, which is why I do these updates. Homicide is justifiable when committed by peace officers and those acting by their command and their aid and assistance under either of the following circumstances. A. In obedience to any judgment of a competent court, meaning a death warrant has been issued in a capital death penalty case which we cover in a different lesson in this class. Or B. When the homicide results from a peace officer's use of force that is in compliance with Penal Code Section 835A. California Penal Code Section 835A outlines the legal framework within which law enforcement officers in California are allowed to use force, including deadly force, in the performance of their duties. Revised significantly in 2019 with the passage of Assembly Bill 392, this legislation represents more stringent control and oversight of police conduct. Let's look at the details of PC 835A and discuss its implications. The legislature finds and declares all of the following: that the authority to use physical force conferred on peace officers by this section is a serious responsibility that shall be exercised judiciously and with respect for human rights and dignity, and for the sanctity of every human life. The legislature further finds and declares that every person has a right to be free from excessive use of force by officers acting under color of law. As set forth below, it is the intent of the legislature that peace officers use deadly force only when necessary in defense of human life. In determining whether deadly force is necessary, officers shall evaluate each situation in light of the particular circumstances of each case, and shall use other available resources and techniques if reasonably safe and feasible to an objectively reasonable officer. That the decision by a peace officer to use force shall be evaluated carefully and thoroughly, in a manner that reflects the gravity of that authority and the serious consequences of the use of force by peace officers, in order to ensure that officers use force consistent with law and agency policies. That the decision by a peace officer to use force shall be evaluated from the perspective of a reasonable officer in the same situation, based on the totality of the circumstances known to or perceived by the officer at the time, rather than with the benefit of hindsight, and that the totality of the circumstances shall account for occasions when officers may be forced to make quick judgments about using force. That individuals with physical, mental health, developmental, or intellectual disabilities are significantly more likely to experience greater levels of physical force during police interactions, as their disability may affect their ability to understand or comply with commands from peace officers. It is estimated that individuals with disabilities are involved in between 1/3 and 1/2 of all fatal encounters with law enforcement. Any peace officer who has reasonable cause to believe that the person to be arrested has committed a public offense may use objectively reasonable force to effect the arrest, to prevent escape, or to overcome resistance. Peace officers are justified in using deadly force upon another person only when the officer reasonably believes, based on the totality of the circumstances, that such force is necessary for either of the following reasons. A. To defend against an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to the officer or to another person. B. To apprehend a fleeing person for any felony that threatened or resulted in death or serious bodily injury, if the officer reasonably believes that the person will cause death or serious bodily injury to another unless immediately apprehended. Where feasible, a peace officer shall, prior to the use of force, make reasonable efforts to identify themselves as a peace officer and to warn that deadly force may be used, unless the officer has objectively reasonable grounds to believe the person is aware of those facts. A peace officer shall not use deadly force against a person based on the danger that person poses to themselves, if an objectively reasonable officer would believe the person does not pose an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to the peace officer or to another person. A peace officer who makes or attempts to make an arrest need not retreat or desist from their efforts by reason of the resistance or threatened resistance of the person being arrested. A peace officer shall not be deemed an aggressor or lose the right to self-defense by the use of objectively reasonable force in compliance with subdivisions B and C to effect the arrest or to prevent escape or to overcome resistance. For the purposes of this subdivision, retreat does not mean tactical repositioning or other de-escalation tactics. For purposes of this section, the following definitions shall apply. 1. Deadly force means any use of force that creates a substantial risk of causing death or serious bodily injury, including, but not limited to, the discharge of a firearm. 2. A threat of death or serious bodily injury is imminent when, based on the totality of the circumstances, a reasonable officer in the same situation would believe that a person has the present ability, opportunity, and apparent intent to immediately cause death or serious bodily injury to the peace officer or another person. An imminent harm is not merely a fear of future harm, no matter how great the fear and no matter how great the likelihood of the harm, but is one that, from appearances, must be instantly confronted and addressed. 3. Totality of the circumstances means all facts known to the peace officer at the time, including the conduct of the officer and the subject leading up to the use of deadly force. In 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court, in the case of Barnes v. Felix 2025, covered in depth in a separate lesson, affirmed the totality of circumstances doctrine. So to summarize the law, officers may use reasonable force to effect an arrest, to prevent escape, or to overcome resistance. What constitutes reasonable force depends on the totality of the circumstances perceived by the officer at the time of the incident. The statute stipulates that deadly force may be used only when necessary in defense of human life. The law emphasizes that evaluations of deadly force must consider whether a reasonable officer in the same situation would have believed the use of such force was necessary. This introduces a standard of objective reasonableness, which has been a cornerstone of federal excessive force law under Graham v. Connor, covered in another lesson. Before I get into an analysis of this law, some facts about officer-involved shootings from the Washington Post. The Post analyzed 917 officer-involved fatal shootings in 2015 from more than 650 police departments nationwide. They found that 55% of suspects were white, 27% were black, 19% were Hispanic. Between 90 and 95% of suspects were attacking police or other citizens. 90% were armed with a weapon. These statistics have remained consistent over several years. The legacy media has been known for misleading the public on these issues. We have become a clickbait society, and I don't see that changing soon. Be careful out there. Now for my analysis. The practical implementation of this law involves extensive training for law enforcement officers. Academy and in-service training programs are designed to help officers understand the legal standards for use of force and to develop skills in de-escalation techniques. Additionally, these police training programs aim to foster decision-making that reflects an awareness of the profound responsibilities involved in the use of force. The legal ramifications of the misuse of force are significant, potentially involving criminal charges, civil rights lawsuits, and significant public and media scrutiny. The ultimate goal is to ensure that all uses of force are not only legally justified, but also ethically and morally defensible. I'm Chief Val Daniels, and that is your lesson on the use of force and justifiable homicide.